It had been a long and exhausting few weeks leading up to my sister's wedding. Everyone seemed to have their own opinions, and the pressure was mounting. I didn't feel fully involved, but I couldn't escape the constant reminders that this was supposed to be a momentous event, something my mother had been dreaming of for years. Yet, beneath all the shiny decorations and careful planning, there was an undeniable tension building up. To be honest, my relationship with my mother and sister had always been complicated. We weren't the close-knit family that you see in picture-perfect social media posts or in those Hallmark movies. There was a sense of distance that had always been there, like an invisible wall. Sure, we loved each other, but the emotional connection was often strained, full of unspoken words and unresolved conflicts. I'd been distant for a long time, even before the wedding planning started. Perhaps it was the way my mother always favored my sister. Or maybe it was the constant pressure to live up to some impossible standard set by my family's expectations. No matter what I did, it never seemed enough. My mother was always too critical, too demanding, and too quick to show disappointment when things didn't go her way. In many ways, I had grown to feel like an outsider in my own family. As my sister's wedding day approached, I tried to stay out of the way. I wasn't involved in the planning, nor did I want to be. I could feel the strain building between me and my mother, and I didn't want to add fuel to the fire. However, my friend, who was a wedding planner, had reached out to me several times to check in. She knew I wasn't on the best terms with my family, but she also knew how much I loved my sister, even if we didn't share a particularly close bond. She called me one afternoon to ask if I was planning to attend the wedding. I hesitated. "No," I said softly. "I have some other work commitments, and I won't be able to make it." The truth was, I had no intention of going. I wasn't ready to face the chaos that had been surrounding the wedding planning. The tension between my mother and sister was palpable, and I knew my presence would only add to it. My friend, however, didn't understand. She pushed a bit further, concerned about the emotional toll the wedding was taking on my sister. "Are you sure?" she asked. "She really wants you there." I didn't know how to respond. On the one hand, I didn't want to add to the drama. On the other hand, I didn't want to disappoint my sister. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that my absence would be a relief, not just for me, but also for everyone involved. The last thing I wanted to do was contribute to the emotional roller coaster that had been my family's life for as long as I could remember. I thought about my decision for a long time. My friend knew I wasn't particularly close to my mom and sister, but what she didn't know was that, on some level, I felt responsible for the mess that had become my sister's wedding. It was a complicated feeling, one that had been gnawing at me since the beginning of the planning stages. I had tried to help. I really had. But every time I offered assistance or suggestions, I was met with resistance. My mother, in particular, insisted on handling everything herself. She made it clear that she didn't want anyone interfering. She had a specific vision in mind for the wedding, and nothing anyone else said seemed to matter. My sister, too, was caught up in the whirlwind of her own expectations and what she thought the wedding should be, often becoming defensive when any of us voiced concerns. As a result, I found myself watching from the sidelines, unable to offer the support I knew my sister needed. As the days passed, the situation only got worse. I started second-guessing my decision to stay away, feeling guilty for not being there for her. But every time I thought about showing up, a wave of dread would wash over me. It wasn't just the wedding itself that troubled me. It was everything else. The anger, the blame, and the feeling of being unimportant. All of it had been building for years, and the wedding felt like the tipping point. In the midst of all this internal turmoil, I received a voicemail from my mother. Listening to it, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. She was furious with me, furious with the situation, and furious with how everything had turned out. In the voicemail, she actually disowned me. The words stung more than I cared to admit, and I couldn't help but replay them over and over in my head. "You're nothing to me," she had said. "I have no daughter anymore." I felt a wave of hurt and confusion wash over me. What was the point of doing everything for them, only to end up disowned? The thought struck me like a cold slap in the face. There had been moments in the past when I felt unappreciated, but this was different. This was final. I had always tried to be the best daughter I could be. I had sacrificed so much of my own happiness to cater to their needs and expectations. But it was never enough. No matter how much I gave, it always seemed to fall short. And now, after all that effort, I was being cast aside. I didn't know how to process the pain. It felt like a betrayal that cut to the core, but at the same time, a small part of me couldn't help but wonder if this was a blessing in disguise. After receiving my mother's voicemail, I switched off my phone. I couldn't handle any more of their drama. I needed to step away, to find some peace, even if it was just for a moment. I took my kids out for the day, hoping to clear my mind and distract myself from the weight of it all. The next day, my friend called again. Her voice was sharp with frustration. She was angry with my sister, and she had every right to be. Apparently, the wedding had been a disaster. The day of the event was chaotic, and my sister's husband was furious. Despite my family's promises to pay extra money to cover the remaining costs of the wedding, they had failed to do so. As a result, my friend's husband, who had helped to arrange the wedding details, was forced to scramble to make things work. But even then, the outcome was far from what they had hoped for. The venue had been fine, but everything else had fallen short. The food was subpar, the decorations were lackluster, and the guests were openly critical. The groom's family was particularly vocal, and it was clear they were not happy with the arrangements. In the middle of all this, my sister had tried to place the blame squarely on my friend, the wedding planner, telling everyone that the planner had messed everything up. This only added fuel to the fire, and my friend's husband was livid. He had been pushed to the limit, but, to his credit, he had held his tongue. Despite his anger, he chose to remain silent and take the blame for everything, not wanting to make things worse for my sister. My mother, ever the diplomat, had pleaded with him to keep quiet, hoping to salvage what little dignity remained in the situation. But as the dust settled, it became clear that the wedding had been a disaster, a far cry from the picture-perfect event my mother had imagined. To make matters worse, they hadn't even paid the promised $10,000. It was a slap in the face, and my friend was left feeling both disrespected and hurt. She had done everything in her power to make the wedding work, but in the end, she was left holding the bag. As I listened to my friend's recounting of the events, I felt embarrassed and ashamed. I couldn't believe my family had let things get so out of control. But more than that, I felt betrayed. I had always tried to do the right thing, but somehow I had ended up in the middle of this mess. I wanted to speak up, to defend my sister and mother, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I was too ashamed, too embarrassed by their behavior. In the end, my friend said she wasn't blaming me, but it was hard not to feel personally implicated in the whole mess. I had been part of it, even if I hadn't been directly involved. The weight of that responsibility felt unbearable. Later, when I spoke with my husband, his reaction surprised me. He was blunt, maybe too blunt. They got what they deserved, he said almost matter-of-factly. They tried to impress everyone with their lies and false promises, and now they have to deal with the consequences. His words stung, but at the same time, I couldn't argue with them. Maybe this was the lesson my family needed to learn, the hard way. After everything that had happened, I was starting to see that my mother's disowning me might actually be a blessing. It was as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I no longer had to be involved in their drama or their false facades. I could walk away, free from the lies, the manipulation, and the hurt. And so I did. After everything that had happened with the wedding and the emotional fallout for my family, I was still reeling. I had no idea how I would ever be able to look at my mother or sister the same way again. The tension between us was palpable, and it felt like the ties that had once bound us were unraveling more with each passing day. Despite everything, my husband and I tried to keep life as normal as possible, focusing on our kids and trying to create some semblance of calm amidst the chaos. It was on a typical evening that things took an unexpected turn. My husband and I had invited my sister and her husband over for dinner, hoping that spending time together might relieve some of the tension. It had been a while since we'd all hung out like that, and in the back of my mind, I was clinging to the hope that maybe things could go back to how they were before all the drama. But deep down, I knew that was unrealistic. The cracks in our relationships were too deep to be filled by a single dinner. We all drank a little more than usual that evening. My husband and I rarely went out anymore, given the stress with the wedding and everything that had transpired, but this evening felt like an opportunity to let go, just a bit. The conversation flowed easily at first, with everyone laughing, joking, and reminiscing about past events. For a brief moment, it felt like the old times, before everything had gone so terribly wrong. But as the evening wore on, and the wine flowed freely, the conversation took a different turn. My husband, who had been in a cheerful and affectionate mood throughout the night, suddenly grew quiet. He was usually the life of the party, but now, something felt off. I could tell something was on his mind, but I wasn't sure what it was. Maybe he had just had too much to drink, I thought. I turned to him, a little tipsy myself, trying to gauge his mood. "What's going on with you?" I asked, half joking, half concerned. He looked at me, his gaze distant for a moment, before turning his attention to my sister, who was sitting across the table. There was a pause, an uncomfortable silence that seemed to hang in the air. My husband smiled at my sister, his expression softened by the wine. Then, with a kind of dreamy look in his eyes, he said, "You know, I've always been in love with her." I blinked, unsure of what he meant.
What?
I asked, not sure I'd heard him correctly. He continued, his words slightly slurred, but there was no mistaking the sincerity in his tone. I've always been in love with your sister. She's incredible. I'd do anything just to be with her. I don't think I could ever truly get over it. She's brilliant. She's everything I've ever wanted. His voice trailed off as he stared at her, almost lost in his own thoughts. My sister, clearly caught off guard, didn't know how to react. She looked at me with a mix of surprise and discomfort, unsure of what to do with the confession that had just been laid bare. I felt the room spin as my stomach dropped. It wasn't the words that shocked me at first, but the way he said them, the vulnerability in his voice, the dreamy expression on his face. It felt like he wasn't even aware of where he was or who he was talking to. It was as if the alcohol had stripped him of all inhibition, laying bare something that had been lurking beneath the surface for far too long. I looked at him, trying to make sense of what was happening. How drunk are you? I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and fear. He chuckled softly, but his smile seemed distant, almost disconnected from the reality around him. Probably plenty, he admitted, still grinning. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to scream, to lash out at him, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The other part of me was terrified of what this meant for our marriage. Was this just the drunken ramblings of someone who had too much to drink, or was there something deeper to it? Had he been hiding these feelings all along? The rest of the evening passed in a haze. We finished dinner, and my sister and her husband left, but my mind was still reeling from what had been said. My husband and I went to bed shortly after, and I tried to push everything out of my mind. But no matter how much I tried, the words kept echoing in my head. I've always been in love with your sister. I couldn't sleep that night. I tossed and turned, my mind spinning in 100 different directions. Had he really meant it? Was he just expressing a passing attraction, something fleeting that would disappear by morning? Or was it something more? The next morning, my husband acted like nothing had happened. He was hungover, of course, but he didn't seem the least bit concerned about what had transpired the night before. He was laughing and joking as if everything was normal, but I couldn't let it go. I couldn't just pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I decided to confront him, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he would explain himself and reassure me that it had all been a mistake. I couldn't live with the uncertainty. After the kids were settled, I sat him down. We need to talk, I said, my voice firm but trembling. He raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard. What's wrong? You said something last night. Do you remember? I asked, keeping my tone as calm as I could manage. He looked at me, confused for a moment, before his face fell. He didn't seem shocked, just weary, as though he knew this conversation was inevitable. I don't remember much after dinner, he admitted, his voice quiet. But if I said something like that, I don't know what to tell you. I was drunk. You told me you were in love with my sister, I pressed. And you said you've always been in love with her. His face went pale. I don't remember that. I don't even remember saying anything about her. But if I did, I'm sorry. I could feel my heart sinking with each word. So, you don't remember saying it, but you think it could be true? I asked, voice trembling. I don't know, he said slowly, his voice full of regret. I've always thought she was beautiful. She's kind and funny, and she's been through a lot. But I love you. You're my wife. I'm committed to you. I love you more than anything. The words felt hollow. The reassurance was there, but it didn't seem to reach me. There was something about the way he said it, something that didn't feel genuine, like he was trying to convince both of us. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Do you think you've ever had feelings for her? Even before last night? He hesitated, as though the question had taken him by surprise. He looked away, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. I've always thought she was attractive, I guess. She's your sister. But it's nothing serious. I never acted on anything. I'm not even sure why I said that. I love you. You're the one I chose. The conversation left me feeling hollow. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But something about it all gnawed at me. How could he express such intense feelings for my sister, especially after all these years? Was I just the convenient option? Or was this a long-hidden truth that had finally come to light? I spent the next few days in a daze, overthinking every word, every gesture, and every moment we'd shared. The intimacy we'd had the night before suddenly felt different. I found myself analyzing everything, wondering if there had been any hidden signs of his feelings for her. Could I have missed them? My husband's reaction was difficult to read. He insisted that he had no desire to act on anything, that it was all just a fleeting feeling he had in the moment. But I couldn't shake the fear that there was more to it. How much had he been suppressing? And why was it coming out now? As I continued to wrestle with these questions, I couldn't help but wonder how my sister felt about it. Did she know? Had she suspected something all along? She had always been my best friend, and yet now, I found myself questioning everything. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit notification bell to stay updated.